Megan Houston, Palm Beach County's Resilience Director. I'm going to introduce my colleague Stephanie Gutierrez, who will talk a little bit about why we're here today before handing it over to Georgia with our Tetra Tech consultant team. Thank you very much for your time.
Can you guys hear me? I'm here. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stephanie Gutierrez. I am a Resilience and Sustainability Analyst for the Palm Beach County Office of Resilience. Thank you all so much for being here today to discuss the flood and sea level rise risk assessment for the town of Hypoluxo. We sincerely appreciate you taking the time to join us and share your insights on this critical project. Community engagement is a top priority for the Office of Resilience. Your participation is essential for two key reasons. First, it ensures our ability. It's important because first, it ensures our ability to keep you informed about potential risks facing our county and the type of work that we are doing to address that. Second, and just as important, it allows us to learn directly from you about your community-specific needs, concerns, and priorities as it relates to flood and sea level rise resilience. So today we aim to give you an overview of the project goals and learn more about what flooding risks you are currently experiencing and what your concerns are for the future. We'll use this feedback to develop a flood and sea level rise risk assessment report, which will help us prioritize flood adaptation projects and make the town of Hypoluxo eligible for flood adaptation funding from the state of Florida. Your local knowledge and perspectives are vital as we work to build a more resilient town of Hypoluxo for the future. Now I'm going to pass it off to Georgia and the rest of the Tetra Tech team to get us started. There will also be an opportunity for questions and discussion throughout the session. Thanks so much.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited to be here to talk about the flood risk vulnerability analysis that we're going to be preparing for the town of Hypoluxo. I'm going to first introduce our team a little bit, then I'll give an overview of the project objectives. Again, we're really going to try and get as much local knowledge from you folks as we can today. So we have a couple different methodologies. We're going to do that. In addition to the question and answers, we do have a technical program called Menti.com, and we can get input from both the audience and the folks online through that application. So have your phones kind of close by so we can get that rolling when we come to that part of the presentation. We really do want to incorporate stakeholder engagement and communication from the community into our analysis, and so we'll talk about what that looks like and the next steps to get the project rolling. So again, I'm with Tetra Tech. My name is Georgia Vince, but I said the number. With me today is Erin Dee. She's a local planner and attorney. We also have the SA Nelson team, who are outreach coordinators and been working with the town to make sure we get a really nice audience here. They did an excellent job. And Clearview Geographic is a small GIS analytical firm that's going to help support the model to get there. Again, Palm Beach County is here, and of course, the town of Hypoluxo staff have been participating in our meetings since we kicked off the project. So the objectives of this flood study is to develop a cohesive strategy to identify what is vulnerable in your town to future flood risks. We're going to be assessing the flooding hazards, and the importance of that is that we have state requirements that Erin will review in order to comply with the state legislation. And then the intent is that this information will help guide the needs and identify community partnerships, maybe identify some other entities that we can partner with to identify projects for the future. And then for those projects, we'd like to increase the eligibility for state and federal grant funding. So I will hand it over to Erin at this point.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm happy to be here with you. It took me all of 2 minutes to drive here because I live in Lantana over by Town Hall. So I am really familiar with your community, living in Lantana, going to the beach, Old Key Limehouse, all of the local haunts that you guys are used to going to. So I'm really thrilled to actually be working on a project right here proximate to our community. But the state of Florida passed legislation in 2021 known as the Always Ready legislation. And what that does is it provides local communities funding for planning projects like this one, or for implementation projects, capital projects to deal with adaptation of assets to flood risk. And the state of Florida has a pretty long history of providing funding to local governments to do these types of projects. The problem was that people were evaluating things in Pensacola a lot differently than they were evaluating them in Key West or locally. And so legislation was necessary to kind of standardize that information because the state collects information from these studies so it can know on a statewide scale what is at risk in our communities across the state of Florida. So one of the things that we do is identify your critical assets that are at risk for various flooding scenarios, both presently and in the future. And we have some standardized data that we have to utilize to do that, to make sure that we're meeting the state's requirements, because all roads to funding lead through a vulnerability assessment, because the state of Florida doesn't want to provide money to local communities unless they know that you have studied what your risks are and that you have done some prioritization about how to use those dollars wisely. So what we look at is the level of exposure. And exposure is just a fancy way of saying where is your stuff and how is it vulnerable to certain types of flood risk. And when I talk about your stuff, what I should note is that this program is really focused on assets, and we will talk about what assets are. But this program is not about providing money to individual property owners to, say, fix their docks or their seawalls or elevate their homes. The state does have programs for those types of projects, at least some of them, but this program is really focused on those community assets that we all depend upon. We look at current conditions, and for this study, we also have to look out at 2050, 2080, and we are also evaluating the 2100 scenario. And we do that because sometimes infrastructure decisions go much further out. And so we want to know what that flood risk looks like. I should note also that the earlier we are in that planning horizon, the more certain we are about what those climatic changes are. The further out we go, we're less certain. So we always look at a range of conditions. We look at a low tidal sea level rise scenario, and we look at a high one. I always like to use the example that, you know, if you're planning for your tiki hut, it may be okay that you are looking at a low level of sea level rise. But if you're trying to look at your water plant or a wastewater plant, you maybe want to be a little bit more conservative and look at those high tidal flooding estimates. And so once we have collected that information about the assets, then we will run some flood scenarios and we will help prioritize what needs to be done when. And so where we have areas where we have a lot of important assets that are going to be subject to flooding, we focus in on those areas as those are the ones in the near term that we really need to evaluate and consider more important than ones that are impacted on down the line. And so part of what we're doing today in this stakeholder process is making sure that we've identified all of the assets, answered any of your questions, and kind of set up the project for success over the next year to get further input on down the line as to what you think is important, and making sure again that we've included all of those assets. So that statute that I mentioned that was promulgated in 2021 says that we have to use a consistent set of elevation data, which is known as North American Vertical Datum of 1988. We have to look at 2 sea level rise scenarios, like I mentioned, a low and a high, and those are based on projections from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration that were updated in 2022. And then we have to look at those 2 planning horizons of 2050, 2080, and then we also look at that 2100 scenario. So the good news is that we will be meeting and exceeding all of that criteria for this vulnerability assessment to help set you up for future funding opportunities from the state of Florida. In this analysis, because you are a coastal community, we all know that you've got the intercoastal in your backyard. Some of you literally have the intercoastal in your backyard. We will be looking at sea level rise. We look at high tide flooding. Sea level rise is that kind of lower or slower, I meant, change in elevation of the seas. We look at high tide flooding, which is your king tides that you see sometimes in October or that you see sometimes in the spring. We get king tides as well. We look at storm surge flooding, which is usually caused by a hurricane or an offshore wind event that's pushing the water levels higher. We also look at rainfall induced flooding, and then we look at what I call the mashup scenario, which is totally possible. A October king tide event, a late season offshore storm, and a 100-year rainfall event. And we know that these events do happen because some of us have been trapped in those events over the last couple of years. We also know that, we have Fort Lauderdale Airport that got shut down last year for a major storm event. So these types of events are really important and they can exacerbate one another. And so we want to know what those potential impacts are. This is just a very quick kind of inundation map that looks at what our flooding analysis. We've been working on this with the countywide. We have some output already. The greens are the lower levels of flooding that is 0.5 foot to 1 foot. The oranges and the reds are the higher levels of flooding. So one thing that we want to do is make sure that this corresponds with your local experience. During a rainfall event, is there a road or an intersection that you come up to where you're like, that area always floods. I know it floods, it's low. Or a certain seawall structure that floods in October. We want to make sure that the flooding information that we produce in the models is consistent with what you all are seeing locally and that it makes sense. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Georgia. If you have your phone accessible, you can use this scan code and it will come up and you will get some questions that Georgia is going to pose to you to help get some of that feedback.
Yeah, so you can either go to your browser and type in menti.com or use your camera to scan the QR code. This survey is just one quick question. We have 3 questions throughout the presentation today. You can use this method. Since you're live here in the audience, you can also just let us know your thoughts when we get to the question, but it also allows us to capture the input from the folks that weren't able to attend in person and are online. So if you get to menti.com, the code is 6107-6557. And I will go to the question, which is very simple question. What kind of flooding have you observed in your community? Sea level rise, some high tide flooding from king tides, storm surge from hurricanes or tropical storms, simply rain-induced flooding from extreme rain events or everyday rain events, or compound flooding, a bunch of stuff happening all at the same time. So for those of you that aren't on the Menti program, if you'd like to tell us some of the things that you've experienced here in the local community, Love to hear from you.
Number 2 and number 3.
Number 2 and number 3. So you guys, I would assume you get 16 times here. I think Aaron, living locally, knows all about those.
Yeah, has anybody tried to launch their boat from Lantana Ramp in October during a king tide? Little difficult, the whole parking lot's underwater.
And so what was the last storm that you guys saw storm surge come through?
Dorian.
Maybe Dorian?
I don't know though, we seem to get it with all of them. Like we get some of it.
Yeah, I had a couple folks put in their responses. So these are the kinds of things that we, like to hear from you folks. If you have neighbors and friends that would like to reach out to us as well, they're like be happy to culminate their information back into the report as well. Anybody else before I move on? Okay.
Well, I have one question. Anybody that lives on the water or notices on their seawall that the tides seem to keep coming up higher on their docks? Or overtopping their docks and, 20 years ago, it didn't do that, but now it does. That would be the sea level rise type of flooding, that you're seeing that kind of slower, consistent, incremental increase. We get that a lot from people.
All right, so critical assets. So the study does focus on the community assets. And so the statute actually identifies which assets we are to include in our study. We look at transportation assets, that can be any of your roads or bridges, critical infrastructure, which are your utilities. You may not own or maintain them, but you do need them to get to your homes. Critical community and emergency facilities, police and fire rescue and hospitals and shelters. And then we do also look at natural resources, cultural and historic resources. So if those are here local, we can include those in the vulnerability assessment. We also look at regionally significant assets. So these are assets that, again, are not owned or maintained by the municipality, but they may have a really importance to the community, maybe critical to make sure that they stay up and running for a long.
Like US one, US one would be a regionally significant asset because it's not owned in the town of Hypoluxo is not required to adapt it, but anybody that lives in this area knows that if US one is flooded, we're all impacted.
All right, so I got another question for you. And this is a free just to type in, what assets in your community are most important to you? We're here at this beautiful town hall. We mentioned the roads and that access to your homes and other assets. Maybe some water, wastewater facilities. Shelters, I don't know if there's a shelter here, or a school.
I don't think so.
All right, there's only like 4 of us. How about parks? You guys have a beautiful park here, and maybe some historic buildings. Maybe this is a historic building. I don't know. But those are the types of things that we're going to be evaluating for the report. Yes, sir.
Just as a little aside, I'm at the end of Parkland East. The only time I can remember really having water problems was before they redid the road or in the sewer system. I don't see any problem. I haven't seen any problems on that particular thing since then.
Right. So that was a stormwater project. They put in stormwater drains to help alleviate that problem. That's great. Yeah, and over time, as the boundary conditions or sea level, water on the outside of the system rises, it may also affect the capacity of that infrastructure as well. So that's something that we'll be looking at. Somebody type on it. So, the project is grant funded, as we mentioned, so, there are certain deliverables that the Department of Rent requires us to submit. First thing that we have been initiated is data collection. So we look at what assets are here. And we'll continue to communicate with town as assets are identified in the next several weeks. We will then perform an exposure analysis on those assets to determine the level of flooding that will affect them present day in 2040 and 2020. 2050. And then we'll run a sensitivity analysis to determine how sensitive those assets are. So is a foot of flooding going to affect it? Is 3 feet of flooding going to affect it? How sensitive is that? We'll look to see if there's any focus areas, any areas of our community that needs to really focus some detailed analysis on to see what could potentially help any flooding that we identify there. And then we will prepare the vulnerability assessment report, which includes a lot of maps and tables and lists. So after a storm event, an extreme storm event, either a tropical storm or a hurricane, what services or facilities are most critical to you during those events? And at our last meeting, they mentioned debris management sites, which is not on our slide here, but it is a critical need after a storm to help with the cleanup.
I would say on our street, the biggest one is the utilities.
Yeah.
Not necessarily from the storm surge, but from the
Wind. So the electric. Yeah.
And question, if the electric gets buried, does that cause a problem during storm surge and flood?
No, so
The jury's kind of out on burying electric. Like some communities want to bury those lines, and there is some level of flood proofing that goes in associated with that. In other communities, they kind of hold back from that because the standard bill and design for FPNL, at least this is FPNL territory, is overhead. So the community hasn't wanted to pay the extra money as a community to underground. So it depends. It depends on what the community will kind of is on that. At least that's what I've seen.
yeah, FPL is doing a lot of putting a lot of lines underground instead of overhead. Again, it is safer, and I don't think there's a risk to those lines going out during a storm from flooding, but it is a cost. And so, I don't know how FPL transfers that to us, but.
And the other concern would be the sewer system during flooding, because we all have pumps. Right? We don't have pumps.
There's a pump somewhere, I assure you. It's probably Boynton Beach managed, but the sewer systems, yes, they do need to turn on and pump the sewage. And so if there's no power to those systems, it can be not fun. But we certainly recognize that Boynton Beach is your utility provider here. And although we haven't done the vulnerability assessment, we certainly can open those doors to communications to make sure that they're addressing those types of issues.
They're about to start, and they've done a vulnerability assessment, but they're about to start an adaptation plan. But I don't know how extra jurisdictional that is beyond their boundaries, but they know that they supply utilities to a lot of areas outside of just the city of Boynton Beach.
All right. So again, I mentioned we're going to be doing some data collection, making sure we have as much data as possible, identify any gaps in data so we can, narrow down those data gaps and find those resources. We perform a GIS modeling, and that map that Erin showed earlier is the elevation of the land with the rainfall overlaid onto that land elevation. So we'll be doing that GIS type modeling, and identifying the focus areas and bringing those results back to you in the future. So these are two surveys that Palm Beach County has related to climate change and flooding. We have a pretty lengthy survey for the climate change, and then the flooding survey is just a quick one where you can put in a geographic location of where you've observed flooding, the type of flooding you're seeing, the depth, and then you can even upload
photos.
And that's all information that we can use to collect for the study. I think that's the end of the presentation, and I can leave these QR codes up here for additional information, but we can take any questions at this time about the funding, what types of projects are being funded, what's going on.
I have a question.
Yes.
We're wanting to service beach erosion where we are. We've got houses along the water, toilets, our pool and a clubhouse. Is this reaching that kind of an area, or is it only public utilities and things like that?
It's mostly public, but we
do, one of those assets that we have to look at are your shorelines, your conservation lands, historic natural resources. So that's one of the assets that we do have to include.
So our shoreline is seated, so it's.
And you're on the intercoastal. No.
Yeah, I'm not.
Okay.
We have houses on the intercoast.
With no seawall.
10 years ago. No seawall.
Yeah.
So this program, just you kind of brought it up. Again, I keep saying this, all roads to funding lead through a vulnerability assessment. And for a community of this size, generally it's a 50% cost share. And what you do each year from July 1 to September 1 is the state will accept grant applications to adapt these assets that are subject to flood risk. And they have funded road elevation projects, enhancing stormwater along roads, public shoreline projects. They have funded the relocation of utilities, water, wastewater utilities. So they funded a lot of different types of capital improvements. But again, this program is very focused on assets, not individual properties. There are some programs that the state does have now, one called Elevate Florida, where they are providing money to individual property owners to elevate structures. So we can provide information to the extent that we know about those programs. We can provide that to you. But this program has been pretty successful. They've put out about $1.8 billion to local communities across the state, both inland and coastal. So it's been a pretty successful program for the state of Florida.
Yes.
You use the term individual property owner.
Mm-hmm.
Where does the community fit into that?
That's a great question. So this program does not fund private property, what I would call private property adaptation. Like you live along the intercoastal, you want to fix your seawall. That's not what this program is about. If there was a publicly owned seawall, that would be eligible for funding, or a local road that the town of Hypoluxo owns and maintains, and you want to elevate that road and put in what we call tidal valves to stop the seawater from coming up the discharge structure, because we see that sometimes. If you, for instance, if you drive in downtown West Palm, Flagler Drive in king tide season is completely flooded with salt water. And what's happening is that salt water is pushing up those tidal valves. And so we can put valves on there to prevent that from happening. The state has funded those types of projects. Or like elevation of a town hall or a town facility, or relocation of utility pumps, that type of thing. So that's what we mean, because the community relies upon the functionality of those assets. So while it may not be fixing your individual property, you could have a project that could fix the road leading to your property. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
So herein lies the problem, difficulty for the town of Hypoluxo. Specifically, the town doesn't own any roads. We don't have any schools. We don't have hospitals. We're made up of single-family homes.
Mhm.
With a small pocket of those directly behind town hall that are on canals, on the intercoastal, and Park Lane East. The rest of the communities in the town of Hypoluxo are homeowners associations, condo associations, and they are all responsible for maintaining their infrastructure within their communities.
Mhm.
So although this is identifying assets that are, I'll say, publicly owned, like this town hall, our parks. I think most of the people here are primarily interested in you guys sort of brought this up at the beginning. What is this going to do for an individual property owner under those types of circumstances? Like Lakeshore has a seawall, but it's their seawall. They have to maintain Las Brisas that was brought up about having the beach. That's owned by Las Brisas, so community. So they're not public assets. So I think we're primarily, most of you are primarily interested in what's going to happen to my home on intercoastal or on sea, on one canals, or how does this apply to those non-public assets?
Well, I have seen grants awarded, for instance, I've seen this in the Keys, for a couple of offshore breakwater projects that have protected private property. And I have seen some like multi-property shoreline projects, but it's not the individual homeowner that lives on the intercoastal waterway that says, I want to fix my seawall. In the grant application process, if you can make the case that the project is going to protect community assets, like some of the infrastructure that is further inland, I have seen those grant applications successful. So it's not all of your roads, but if you can make the case in the grant application that during a king tide event, there's a foot of water on this particular road, the stormwater is failing, and 20 people can't access their homes for a week at a time, I have seen those grant applications awarded.
Even though they're privately owned roads.
Yes.
They're not owned by the town.
They don't make the distinction in that asset list in the statute as to whether or not the roads are public or private. They tell you that you have to inventory all of the roads, all of the bridges. So it's how compelling can you make the case in the grant application. I really shouldn't be answering your question because I'm kind of spilling my secret sauce. But that's how you advocate in your grant application. Specifically with the shoreline projects, I've seen that pretty successful as long as you're doing something like a living shoreline or something that has a natural component. I've seen those successful because the argument is that if we do something along this shoreline, we're protecting the properties, like the homes behind it, but we're also protecting the roads, the water, the wastewater, the stormwater functions from that surge effect. So it's a little, I wouldn't say it's sneaky. I guess it's kind of sneaky because, again, the state is really focused on assets. But for instance, you have to identify hospitals. Counties and local governments do not own and maintain hospitals, but you have to identify them as an asset because it's something that the community relies upon. You rely upon roads to be able to access, get in and out, evacuation, so there are ways around that in the grant applications to make that compelling argument. But you can't make the compelling argument if you don't identify the assets and, do the vulnerability assessment. So that's kind of the first start. But those are just some examples that I know that I have seen awarded. I think we've gotten like 3 shoreline projects in the Keys where it wasn't protecting a hospital, it wasn't protecting a big community asset, they were protecting neighborhoods. And the argument that we made was it's the infrastructure behind that shoreline project that we are protecting. And of course, the ancillary benefit is you're protecting the property owners as well. So you're not leading with that argument, you're leading about the assets, if you get what I mean.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Question, in your application, do you have to have a solution already identified, or do you simply say, hey, we got a problem, we'd like to have,
That's a great question. The more cooked your solution, the better you're gonna do in the application process. And what I mean by that is if you've gone down the path of hiring an engineering firm to design it and you've got plans. For instance, if you've got your permits in hand, that application is gonna score higher than something that is more conceptual, like you pointed out. So that's what I mean by the more cooked, the more real the project is. They also want to see a commitment letter for the match, so a line item in a budget and or a letter from the mayor or the manager that says, should this grant get awarded, we've got the 50% cost share. Or, some communities use, for instance, if they have a stormwater assessment or a roads assessment or something else that they are considering for a funding source. But the more committed and the further along the project is, the more likely it is to get funded. Any more questions? Do we have any questions online? Right, or any questions online? We'll hang out. Yeah, we'll hang out for a few minutes if anybody wants to come speak with us after we close the presentation and the meeting, but thank you so much. Oh, we have
Snacks.
Yeah, snacks. And yes, and non-alcoholic beverages. So thank you all so much for your time today. We really appreciate it. Thank you.